I remember the exact second I realized I was about to die. The plane's fuselage was tearing apart like wet cardboard, metal screaming in the ways metal should never scream. Lightning had just punched through our cabin with a flash so bright it burned white spots into my vision. And then suddenly, nothing beneath me, no floor, no walls, just freezing air ripping past my face as I tumbled out into the black Peruvian sky, still strapped into my row of 3 seats, spinning end over end like a broken toy. Below me, 3,000 meters down, the Amazon rainforest looked like tiny green broccoli heads, rushing up faster and faster to crush me flat. I was 17 years old. It was Christmas Eve, 1971. And in those eternal seconds of freefall, I whispered goodbye to my mother, to my father waiting at home, to every dream I'd ever had. I knew I was dead, except I wasn't. I hit the jungle canopy and somehow, impossibly, I survived. But here's the part nobody talks about. The part that still haunts me decades later. 14 other people also survived that initial impact just like I did. 14 passengers fell from that disintegrating plane, crashed through the trees, and woke up alive in the jungle. And then, one by one, over the next few days, every single one of them died waiting for rescue that never came. So the real question isn't how I survived falling from the sky. The question is, what did I do differently during those 11 days of absolute hell that kept me breathing when 14 others gave up and faded away? Stay with me until the very end of this story, because that answer isn't what you think. It's not about being strong or brave or lucky. It's about one forgotten piece of advice my father gave me years earlier. Something so simple you'll wonder why it doesn't save more lives. And I promise you, by the time I reveal it, you'll understand why I'm the only one who made it out alive. My name is Juliane Koepke. This is my story. Every word of it is true. Every detail burned into my memory like scars on my skin. And trust me, by the end, you'll never look at survival the same way again. Let me take you back to where it all began, because you need to understand who I was before the fall to understand how I survived after it. December 24th, 1971, Jorge Chavez International Airport in Lima, Peru. The terminal was absolutely packed, humidity hanging in the air like a wet blanket, families everywhere hauling overstuffed suitcases wrapped with Christmas ribbons, everyone desperate to get home before the holiday. I was one of them, walking through that chaos beside my mother Maria, completely unaware that in less than 2 hours, everything I knew about life would be ripped away at 10,000 feet. I'd just graduated from high school 2 days earlier, 17 years old, blonde hair hanging down past my shoulders, wearing this ridiculous white mini dress because my mother insisted we needed to look presentable for travel. She was always like that, proper and dignified even in the sweltering Lima heat. We were heading to Pucallpa, a small city carved out of the jungle in eastern Peru, and from there to our family's biological research station called Panguana. That place, not Lima, not Germany where my parents were born, Panguana was home. A collection of wooden buildings on stilts surrounded by millions of acres of untamed Amazon rainforest, where the only sounds were howler monkeys screaming at dawn, insects buzzing in clouds, and rain drumming on tin roofs like a never-ending percussion concert. People always ask me if I had a normal childhood. I guess it depends on what you mean by normal. While other teenagers my age in the early 70s were hanging out at shopping malls, sneaking cigarettes, going to drive-in movies, I was learning to identify a bushmaster snake by the pattern it leaves in the mud before it coils to strike. While they were stressing about what outfit to wear to school dances, I was learning which jungle berries would give you nutrients and which would twist your intestines into knots and kill you within 6 hours. My parents were zoologists, both of them German immigrants who'd left Europe after World War II to dedicate their entire lives to studying the biodiversity of the Amazon basin. My father, Hans Wilhelm Köpke, studied everything from tropical birds to bats, to the intricate relationships between predator and prey in the canopy. My mother, Maria, specialized in owls and tropical ecology, spending weeks at a time in observation towers recording behavior patterns. By the time I turned 14, they decided Lima's schools weren't teaching me what I really needed to know, so they brought me to live full-time at Panguana, and that's where I learned the skills that would later save my life, though I didn't know it at the time. I learned to read the jungle not as a terrifying green maze, but as a complex ecosystem, with rules and patterns and logic. Dad would take me on hikes through terrain that would make most people turn back in terror, pointing out details I'd never notice on my own. The way certain trees grow only near water sources, how to tell if an animal trail is fresh or abandoned, which insects are harmless and which carry diseases that'll put you in a coma. And one afternoon, I remember it so clearly it could have been yesterday, we were hiking along a stream when I asked him what to do if I ever got lost out here. He stopped, looked me dead in the eye with this serious expression he saved for important lessons, and said something I'd replay in my head 1,000 times years later. Julianne, if you're ever lost in the rainforest, find water. Even the smallest trickle. Follow it downstream. A trickle becomes a creek becomes a stream becomes a river, and rivers always lead to people. Always go with the flow. I nodded, filed it away like homework, and we kept walking. I never imagined those words would be the difference between my name on a survivor's list and my name carved into a gravestone. But that Christmas Eve, standing in Lima Airport, I didn't want to be heading into the jungle. I wanted to stay in the city, celebrate my graduation like a normal 17-year-old. Parties with classmates, maybe meet a boy, sleep in past dawn for once. My mother had wanted to leave earlier, book our flight for December 19th or 20th, get to Panguana with time to spare. But I begged her to let me stay for my graduation ceremony on the 23rd. I'd worked hard, earned honors, and I deserved to walk across that stage with my class. So we compromised. We'd fly out on Christmas Eve instead, December 24th, arriving at Panguana just in time for Christmas dinner with my father. Lanza, Flight 508, operated by Lockheed Electra turboprop, scheduled departure 11:30 a.m., 50-minute flight time to Pucallpa. On paper, it looked routine, safe, quick. What my mother and I didn't know, what we should have known, was that Lanza had a reputation, and not a good one. This airline had suffered 4 crashes in the previous 3 years alone. Pilots were known for cutting corners, skipping maintenance checks, flying routes they shouldn't fly in, weather they shouldn't fly in. My father had actually called us the night before, his voice crackling over the terrible phone connection from Panguana, practically yelling into the receiver, "Don't fly Lanza. Take any other airline. Wait a few days if you have to. Just don't fly them." But every other airline was completely sold out. Christmas was the busiest travel time of the year. And my mother wanted to surprise my father, show up right on schedule like she promised. So we bought the tickets anyway. It was just one flight. 50 minutes. What could possibly go wrong? At 11:30 a.m., exactly, we boarded through the rear stairs. That distinctive jet fuel smell mixing with someone's overpowering perfume in the cabin. I found my seat, 19F, window seat on the right side of the aircraft. My mother settled in beside me in 19E, reaching over to squeeze my hand like she always did during takeoffs. She hated flying, always had. Her palm would get sweaty, and she'd grip the armrest until her knuckles went white. The plane filled up around us, 92 souls total packed into that metal tube. Families with small children clutching new Christmas toys, business travelers in wrinkled suits nursing their morning coffee, a group of teenagers heading home from boarding school, 6 crew members doing their pre-flight routine, checking overhead bins, demonstrating seatbelt procedures nobody ever watches. The cabin had this festive energy, people chatting about holiday plans. Someone in the back had smuggled on a small Christmas tree that kept poking into the aisle. I pressed my forehead against the cold window as the engines roared to life, watching the ground crew wave us forward. We taxied down the runway, picked up speed, and lifted into the hazy Peruvian sky. Within minutes, the sprawling chaos of Lima disappeared below us, replaced by the endless emerald ocean of the Amazon rainforest stretching to every horizon. From up there, at cruising altitude, the jungle looks almost peaceful, beautiful even. Like a soft green carpet you could fall into and bounce right back up. Yeah, right. 20 minutes into the flight, things started to change. The pilot's voice crackled through the intercom, that standard reassuring tone they all use. "Folks, we've got some turbulence ahead, nothing to worry about, but we're going to ask everyone to return to their seats and keep those seatbelts fastened nice and tight. Standard procedure, nobody panicked." Amazon flights hit rough air all the time. The jungle generates its own weather systems, massive heat rising off all the vegetation, creating unpredictable conditions. Passengers shifted a bit, conversations continued. A baby cried somewhere toward the front. Then the bump started. Not gentle little wobbles, hard jolts that rattled the overhead bins and made luggage shift. The plane shuddered like it was driving over railroad tracks at high speed. I watched my mother's grip tighten on the armrest, saw her close her eyes and mouth what might have been a prayer. Outside my window, dark clouds were building, stacking up into towering columns that looked almost solid. That should have been our first real warning. Those weren't normal rain clouds. Those were cumulonimbus formations, the kind that generate their own lightning factories, massive electrical storms that can tear aircraft apart. Any experienced pilot should have seen them on radar and gone around, added 20 minutes to the flight time, taken the safe route. But the crew of Flight 508 made a decision that day that would kill 91 people. They flew straight into it. Maybe they were behind schedule. Maybe they wanted to save fuel. Maybe they genuinely thought they could punch through before the worst hit. We'll never know their reasoning because none of them survived to explain it. What we do know is that at exactly 12:36 p.m., at an altitude of 6,400 meters, our Lockheed Electra entered the heart of that storm system, and everything exploded. The turbulence went from uncomfortable to violent in seconds. The plane dropped, really dropped, like hitting an air pocket in an elevator with the cables cut. My stomach lurched into my throat. Screams erupted throughout the cabin. Overhead bins popped open, luggage tumbling out, someone's suitcase bounced off a seat back and split open, clothes flying everywhere. The Christmas tree went rolling down the aisle. Then the lights flickered once, twice, and died completely. Emergency lighting kicked in, casting everything in this sickly red glow that made it feel like we'd entered hell itself. My mother grabbed my arm, her nails digging into my skin hard enough to leave marks. "Julianne," she whispered, and I could barely hear her over the roar of wind and screaming metal and people crying. Then I saw it. Through my window, I saw the right wing, and I watched as lightning, actual goddamn lightning, struck it dead center. The flash was so bright I had to close my eyes, so loud it felt like my eardrums would burst. When I opened them again, the wing was on fire, not smoke. Fire. Real flames streaming back from where the lightning had punched a hole straight through the fuel tank. And then, as I watched in frozen horror, the wing started to break apart. Metal peeling away in strips, rivets popping like gunshots, the entire structure just disintegrating. The plane rolled hard to the right, tilting at an angle that defied physics. People who'd unbuckled were thrown against a ceiling. A flight attendant slammed into a seat so hard I heard bones crack. My mother squeezed my arm one final time and looked at me with tears streaming down her face. "This is it, Jewel," she said. Those were the last words she ever spoke to me. "This is it." And then the floor vanished, just gone. The fuselage ripped open like a tin can, wind exploding into the cabin with a roar louder than anything I'd ever heard. People were sucked out instantly, still strapped to their seats, gone into the black void in a heartbeat. I felt my row of 3 seats, 19D, E, and F, tear free from its moorings. For one impossible second, we were suspended inside the plane, and then we were outside it, tumbling through empty sky. The last thing I saw was the plane breaking into 3 major sections, each one spinning away on its own trajectory. The last thing I heard was wind, just howling, freezing wind. And then I blacked out, my mind unable to process what was happening, my body going limp as I fell 3,000 meters toward the earth. Experts still debate exactly what happened during those 3,000 meters of freefall, how the physics worked out in my favor when they failed 91 other people on that plane. The best theory goes like this: my row of seats, those 3 connected chairs still bolted together, acted like a crude helicopter rotor, spinning as it fell, creating just enough air resistance to slow the descent from instantly fatal to merely catastrophic. The massive updraft from the thunderstorm we'd flown into pushed against us from below, cushioning the fall further, and then there was the canopy itself, that dense layer of vines and branches and leaves stacked hundreds of feet deep, each layer absorbing a bit more impact as we crashed through. But 14 other passengers got that same lucky combination of factors. 14 people hit the ground breathing, heart still pumping, brain still firing. I know because rescue teams found their bodies later, scattered across miles of jungle, and the autopsies showed they survived the initial impact. They just didn't survive what came after. So why me? That question gnawed at me then, gnaws at me still, but I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me take you back to that first moment of consciousness. I don't remember the actual impact. My brain shut down somewhere during the fall. Probably a mercy, because the trauma of watching the ground rush up would have been too much to process. What I do remember is waking up on Christmas morning, the 25th of December, lying on my back in a small depression of mud and rotting leaves, completely alone. The first sensation was smell, that thick, wet earth odor mixed with decomposing vegetation that you only get deep in primary rainforest. Then sound came rushing back. Birds calling, insects buzzing in swarms, the distant screech of howl a monkey somewhere in the canopy, and then pain. God, the pain hit all at once like someone flipped a switch. My head throbbed with what I'd later learn was a severe concussion, making the world tilt and swim even when I tried to hold still. My right collarbone was broken. I could feel the bone grinding against itself when I tried to move my arm, sending sharp jolts through my chest. My right knee had swelled to twice its normal size, the ligament torn from the impact making it nearly impossible to bend. My right eye was swollen half shut. Blood vessel burst from the sudden pressure changes during the fall, turning my vision red and blurry on that side. And my arm had a deep gash, running from shoulder to elbow, already starting to fester in the humidity, edges turning an angry purple. I was wearing what remained of my white mini dress, now torn to shreds and stained brown with mud and blood. One sandal missing. Cuts and bruises covering every exposed inch of skin. I unbuckled the seatbelt with fingers that didn't want to cooperate, sliding off the seat onto the muddy ground. The row of chairs was tangled in the lower branches of a small tree, hanging at an angle like some bizarre jungle gym. Standing took forever, every movement triggering fresh waves of agony from my knee, but I forced myself upright because staying there meant dying there. The clearing around me was maybe 20 feet across, branches broken overhead where I'd crashed through, sunlight filtering down in thin shafts through the canopy, and that's when the real panic set in. "Mom," I called out, my voice hoarse and weak. "Mom, can you hear me?" Nothing but echoes and bird calls. I stumbled forward, pushing through ferns and vines, looking for any sign of the plane, of other survivors, of my mother. I found scattered debris. A suitcase burst open with clothes spilling out, a child's stuffed animal half buried in the dirt, a section of wing twisted beyond recognition. But no bodies, no voices. The jungle had swallowed everything. I sank to my knees and sobbed, tears mixing with the blood and dirt on my face. Why was I alive when everyone else was gone? What kind of universe lets a teenage girl survive a fall from the sky only to die alone in the jungle? But crying wouldn't save me. I wiped my face with the back of my hand, forced myself to breathe slowly, and try to think. Dad's voice echoed in my memory from all those hikes at Panguana. Find water, follow it downstream. Water always leads to people. It was the only plan I had. Scanning the area, I spotted a tiny trickle of water seeping through the underbrush nearby, barely more than a wet patch in the mud, but it was flowing, moving downhill, and that meant it would eventually grow into something bigger. I started following it, one agonizing step at a time, dragging my injured leg through the undergrowth. The pain in my knee felt like knives with every step, but I'd learned something at Panguana that most people never understand about survival. Pain is just information. It tells you something's wrong, but it can't actually stop you unless you let it. So I didn't let it. I kept moving, eyes fixed on that pathetic little trickle of brown water, because it was the only thing connecting me to civilization. Day one blurred into an endless cycle of walking, stumbling, falling, getting back up. The stream widened gradually as smaller tributaries joined it, growing from a trickle to something you could actually call a creek. The jungle pressed in from all sides, vegetation so thick I sometimes had to crawl through gaps between vine-wrapped trees, thorns tearing at my already shredded dress. The heat was oppressive, easily over 90 degrees Fahrenheit, with humidity that made every breath feel like drowning. Sweat stung my wounds constantly, turning the gash on my arm into a constant burning sensation. I drank from the creek whenever I could, scooping water with my hands, trying not to think about the parasites and bacteria that were probably swimming in it. But dehydration would kill me faster than any parasite, so I drank and hoped my immune system could handle whatever I was swallowing. By afternoon, hunger started gnawing at my stomach, a dull ache that grew sharper with every hour. Everything around me looked suspicious. Plants I didn't recognize from my time at Panguana, bright red berries that could be nutritious or deadly poisonous, mushrooms that might sustain me or shut down my organs. Without certainty, eating anything was just slower suicide, so I walked on empty. The jungle sounds kept me on edge all day. Every rustle in the bushes could be a monkey or could be a jaguar stalking silently through the undergrowth. I'd seen jaguar tracks on hikes with Dad, learned how they hunt by ambush, how they can drag prey twice their weight up into trees. I'd also learned about bushmaster snakes, the deadliest vipers in the Amazon, aggressive and fast. Every step through the leaf litter could land on a coiled snake I couldn't see with my damaged vision. The fear was constant, a low-level terror humming in the background of every moment. But fear, like pain, is just information. Acknowledge it, use it to stay alert, but don't let it paralyze you. Night fell fast in the rainforest, the canopy blocking the sun well before actual sunset, turning everything to shadows and deeper shadows. I curled up beside the creek under a broad leaf, shivering despite the heat because shock and blood loss had wrecked my body's temperature regulation. The sounds changed at night. Different birds, frogs croaking in deafening choruses, things moving through the trees that I couldn't identify. Sleep came in brief, fitful bursts haunted by dreams of the plane breaking apart, of Mom's hand slipping from mine, of falling forever into green nothing. I woke at dawn soaked with dew, every muscle stiff and screaming, and forced myself to start walking again. The creek was definitely bigger now, maybe 3 feet wide, flowing with purpose. Progress had to be progress. Day 2 hit me with hunger that went beyond discomfort into genuine weakness. My vision kept blurring at the edges, black spots dancing when I stood up too fast. The pain in my knee had settled into a constant throb, the joint swelling so badly I could barely bend it anymore, reducing my walk to a lurching limp. But I pushed on, following the creek as it wound through terrain that all looked identical. Trees, vines, mud, more trees. Then I stumbled on a gift that felt like divine intervention. More wreckage half buried in the undergrowth, including a small suitcase that had burst open on impact. Inside, scattered among ruined clothes, were wrapped Christmas candies, boiled sweets in bright foil, someone's holiday treats that never made it to their destination. I grabbed them with shaking hands, unwrapped one, and let the sugar dissolve on my tongue. The sweetness hit my system like electricity, energy flooding back in a rush that brought tears to my eyes. I rationed them carefully, allowing myself one every few hours, making them last. Those candies probably added 2 or 3 days to my survival time, buying me the energy to keep moving when my body wanted to shut down. But the jungle fought back against every small victory. Vines seemed designed to snag feet, thorns to catch skin. Clouds of mosquitoes descended on my wounds, laying eggs in the exposed flesh. I could feel them itching already, new infections blooming. And the heat never let up, turning the day into a sweltering hell where even the shade offered no relief. Night 2 brought rain, a sudden tropical downpour that turned the jungle floor to slick mud within minutes. I slipped, landed hard on my bad knee, and screamed so loud it scared a flock of parrots from the canopy above. Crawling under a fallen log for shelter, I huddled there while water pooled around me, soaking what remained of my dress, turning my shivering into violent shakes. The temperature had dropped maybe 10 degrees, nothing by normal standards, but in my weakened state, it felt like hypothermia setting in. I thought about my father waiting at Panguana, probably pacing the dock, wondering why we hadn't arrived. Did he know yet about the crash? Had the news reached him? The thought of his face when he found out made me cry again, but I swallowed it down. Crying used energy I couldn't spare. At dawn, I crawled out from under the log, noted with grim satisfaction that the creek had become a proper stream now, maybe 10 feet wide, and kept following it downstream. Day 3. Dad always said 3 days without water kills you, 3 weeks without food. I had water. I could last. That's when the fever started creeping in around midday on the third day. My arm wound was hot to the touch, pulsing with infection, the edges turning black. Sepsis, if it took hold, would kill me as surely as starvation. But I had no antibiotics, no way to properly clean it, nothing but creek water and hope. The fever brought hallucinations with it, fragments of dreams bleeding into waking moments. I heard voices calling my name, saw shadows of other passengers waving from the trees, beckoned by ghosts. No, Mom's face appeared in the ripples of the stream, smiling like she used to on our hikes. "Keep going, Jewel," she whispered, and I didn't know if it was real memory or fever dream. I shook my head, splashed creek water on my face, focused on the flow, follow the water. That's all I had to do. Just follow the water. Day 4 brought an unexpected discovery. A pool in the stream where the current slowed and fish, actual small fish darting through the shallows. I tried catching them with my hands, splashing around like an idiot, failing completely, but feeling hope flicker for the first time since the crash. Fish meant the stream was healthy. Healthy streams grew into rivers. Rivers had people. The logic held together, barely, through the fever haze. But by evening of day 4, exhaustion finally caught up with me. I collapsed on a sandbar beside the stream, unable to take another step, staring up at the canopy where stars peeked through gaps in the leaves. Orion hung there, the same constellation I used to watch from Penguina's roof with my parents, Dad teaching me to navigate by stars. "Orion's belt always points to Sirius," he'd say. "If you're lost, the stars will guide you home." But stars couldn't carry me. I had to carry myself. "Keep going, Jewel," I whispered in Dad's voice, in Mom's voice, in my own voice. "Just keep going." And when dawn came on day 5, I did. The stream had widened into something approaching a small river, the current stronger, the banks showing signs of human activity. Old cut branches, a rusted can half buried in mud. Civilization was out there somewhere. I just had to reach it. But that's when I noticed something that would turn the next 6 days into a waking nightmare. My arm was moving, not my muscles. Something under my skin, wriggling and alive. And when I peeled back the filthy fabric covering the wound, I saw them. Dozens of white segmented larvae, botfly maggots burrowing deeper into my flesh, feeding on me from the inside out. The scream that tore from my throat echoed through the jungle, scattering birds, and for the first time since the fall, I genuinely thought I might not make it out alive. If you've never experienced botfly larvae eating you from the inside, let me paint the picture. These aren't tiny parasites you can ignore. Each larva is maybe half an inch long, white and segmented like a fat maggot, and they burrow deep into muscle tissue to feed and grow. The flies lay their eggs in open wounds. The eggs hatch within hours in the tropical heat, and then the larvae tunnel in, using tiny hooks to anchor themselves while they consume your flesh. I'd seen this happen to our dog at Penguina once, maybe 3 or 4 larvae in her leg. Dad had treated it by pouring gasoline over the wound. The fumes suffocate the larvae and force them to back out where you can extract them with tweezers. But that was 3 larvae in a controlled environment with medical supplies nearby. I had dozens, maybe more, burrowing through the infected gash on my right arm. And I was alone in the jungle with nothing but filthy creek water and fever-induced panic. The itching had started days earlier, but I'd assumed it was just the infection spreading. Now, watching them writhe under my skin, I understood the true horror of my situation. Without treatment, gangrene would set in within days. Sepsis would follow. I'd die slowly, conscious and aware, as my own body rotted from the inside out. Day 6 became a blur of agony and determination as I pushed forward along the river, which had now grown wide enough that I could see clear across to the opposite bank, maybe 30 feet away. The current was stronger here, the water deeper, signs that I was getting closer to something, though I had no idea what or how far. The larvae moved constantly, a sickening sensation, like dozens of tiny fingers massaging my arm from inside. The pain had evolved beyond sharp into something deeper and more persistent, a throbbing ache that radiated from my elbow to my shoulder and made every movement of that arm pure torture. But I couldn't stop moving. Stopping meant dying, and I wasn't ready to die. Not after surviving a 10,000-foot fall, not after 5 days of walking on a shattered knee. The jungle had tried to kill me half a dozen ways already and failed every time. I'd be damned if I let a few maggots finish the job. The riverbank started showing more evidence of human activity as I stumbled downstream through the afternoon heat. A branch cut cleanly with a machete rather than broken naturally. An old beer bottle half buried in the mud. The label faded but still recognizable. A section of rope tied around a tree trunk, frayed and rotting, but obviously man-made. Each discovery sent a jolt of hope through my exhausted body. People came here, maybe not often, maybe not recently, but they came. That meant camps or villages or something ahead. I just had to keep walking long enough to reach them. Night 6 brought another punishing rainstorm, the kind of downpour that turns visibility to zero within seconds. I found shelter under an overhanging rock face, huddled there shivering while water cascaded down in sheets, and tried not to think about the larvae growing fatter on my tissue. The fever spiked that night, my body fighting the infection with everything it had left, which wasn't much. Hallucinations came in waves, Mom sitting beside me under the rock, smiling and stroking my hair like she did when I was little. "Almost there, sweetheart," she whispered. "Just a little further." I reached out to touch her hand and grabbed empty air. The tears came then, hot and bitter, because I knew she was gone. I knew I was alone. But I also knew I couldn't give up, because giving up meant her death was for nothing. Day 7 dawned humid and oppressive, the air so thick with moisture it felt like breathing through a wet cloth. My arm had swollen to nearly twice its normal size, the skin stretched tight and shiny around the wound, pus leaking from the edges where the larvae had created exit holes. I could count at least 20 distinct movement points under the skin now, maybe more deeper in where I couldn't see. The smell was getting worse too, that sickly sweet odor of infection that meant necrosis was setting in. I had maybe 2 or 3 days before the sepsis reached my bloodstream and shut down my organs. Less if I was unlucky. The urgency pushed me faster despite the weakness, following the river as it bent sharply to the left around a massive fallen tree. And that's when I saw it, a small hut on the opposite bank, maybe 100 yards downstream. Thatched roof, wooden walls, a canoe pulled up on the muddy shore. No smoke from the chimney, no people visible, but it was clearly maintained, not abandoned. Somebody used this place. My heart hammered so hard I thought it might burst. After 7 days of walking, 7 days of pain and fear and slowly dying, I'd found civilization, or at least the edge of it. Crossing the river should have been impossible with my injuries, but desperation makes you do stupid things. I waded in at a shallow point, the current immediately pulling at my legs, trying to sweep me downstream. The water came up to my chest at the deepest point, cold enough to make me gasp, and every step on the rocky bottom sent fresh jolts through my ruined knee. Halfway across, I slipped, went under completely, swallowed a mouthful of river water, and came up choking and panicking. But I made it, crawling up the far bank on my hands and knees, sobbing with relief and exhaustion. The hut was real, solid. Built from rough-cut planks with a corrugated tin roof, one room maybe 12 feet square, empty except for a few supplies in the corner. A coil of rope, some fishing gear, and my eyes locked onto it like a drowning person spotting a life preserver. A red plastic gasoline can for outboard motors, maybe 2 gallons worth, sitting beside the doorway. I picked it up with shaking hands, unscrewed the cap, smelled the sharp chemical tang of fuel. This was it. This was how I'd save myself. I'd watched Dad treat our dog's botfly infection years earlier at Penguana, so I knew the theory. Gasoline fumes are toxic to the larvae, suffocating them and forcing them to back out of the wound to escape the chemical exposure. Once they surface, you can grab them and pull them free before they burrow back in. Simple in principle. Absolute hell in practice. I sat down on the hut's wooden floor, held my infected arm over a gap between the planks so the extracted larvae would fall through, and took 3 deep breaths to prepare myself. Then I poured gasoline directly onto the wound. The pain was indescribable. Imagine every nerve ending in your arm catching fire simultaneously, while someone stabs you with 1,000 hot needles. I screamed loud enough to scare birds from the trees half a mile away, a raw animal sound I didn't know I was capable of making. My vision went white at the edges, consciousness flickering like a candle in the wind. But I couldn't pass out because passing out meant losing my chance to extract the larvae while they were surfacing. So I bit down on a piece of rope, tasted blood from where my teeth cut into my lip, and watched through tears as the larvae started emerging. They came writhing out of the wound like something from a nightmare, white and segmented and obscenely fat from feeding on my tissue. I grabbed the first one with my left hand. My right arm was useless, the muscles not responding properly, and pulled. It came free with a wet popping sound, maybe 1.5 inches long, and I flung it away in disgust. Then another and another. I counted as I went, needing the numbers to stay focused through the agony. 10, 15, 20. The gasoline kept doing its work, the fumes penetrating deep into the wound cavity, suffocating the larvae in their tunnels. 25, 30. My fingers were slippery with blood and pus, making it hard to grip the squirming larvae, but I kept going because stopping meant they'd burrow back in and I'd have to start over. 35. That was the last one. The wound finally still, no more movement under the skin. 35 botfly larvae extracted from a single wound. The medical literature I read years later said that numbers should have killed me from toxic shock alone, but I was 17 and stubborn and too angry at the universe to die in a jungle hut. I passed out then, my body finally giving into the trauma, collapsing sideways on the wooden floor in a pool of blood and gasoline. When I came to, could have been minutes or hours later, impossible to tell. The sun had shifted lower in the sky, and the pain had evolved from sharp to a deep, throbbing ache that seemed to encompass my entire arm. But the larvae were gone. All of them. I'd done it. I'd literally pulled myself back from the edge of death, with nothing but gasoline and willpower. The wound looked horrific, like someone had taken an ice cream scoop to my arm, but it was clean, or cleaner at least. I washed it with river water, wrapped it in a strip of fabric torn from my dress, and allowed myself 30 seconds of victory before reality set in. I was still alone, still injured, still miles from anywhere. The hut was clearly a temporary camp for loggers or fishermen, which meant they'd come back eventually. But when? A day? A week? I had no way to know. So I drank water from my cupped hands at the river's edge, found a corner of the hut to curl up in and waited, because that's all I could do anymore. Walk and wait and hope. Day 8. The sun rose over the river in a blaze of orange and red, absolutely beautiful in a way that felt mocking given my situation. Still no sign of the hut's owners. I spent the day drifting in and out of consciousness, the fever still spiking, my body fighting infections plural now. The arm wound, various smaller cuts gone septic, probably something intestinal from drinking untreated river water for a week straight. At some point I heard an engine in the distance, a motorboat passing somewhere downstream, and I tried to scream for help, but my voice came out as a hoarse croak that wouldn't carry 10 feet. The boat passed without slowing. Night 8 was another fever dream, talking to Mom and Dad like they were there in the hut with me, describing the crash and the walk in detail that made no sense. Woke on day 9 to the sound of voices, real ones this time, men speaking Spanish with the rough accent of rural Amazonian loggers. 3 of them approaching the hut from downstream in a canoe, talking and laughing about something. I crawled to the doorway on my hands and knees, barely strong enough to hold myself upright, and croaked "Ayuda," help, in the loudest voice I could manage. They saw me and stopped dead, their laughter cutting off like someone flipped a switch. One of them actually took a step backward, eyes wide, and muttered "Phantasma," ghost. I don't blame him for the reaction. I'd seen my reflection in the river that morning, barely recognizable as human. Blonde hair matted into a solid mass of mud and blood, face swollen and covered in insect bites. The dress reduced to a few shreds of fabric barely covering my torso, one arm wrapped in a filthy bandage, the other covered in cuts and bruises, and I was white, European white, which they probably hadn't expected to find in the middle of nowhere. "Por favor," I begged in my broken Spanish. "Avión, accidente, necesito ayuda." "Please, airplane, accident, I need help." The words came out slurred, fever thick, but they understood enough. The oldest one, maybe 40 with a graying beard, approached cautiously and knelt beside me, asking questions I could barely process. How long had I been out here? Where was the crash? Was I alone? I answered as best I could, pointing upriver, the direction I'd come from. holding up fingers to indicate 11 days, nodding yes when he asked if I was the only survivor. They conferred quickly in a dialect I couldn't follow. Then the bearded one picked me up, actually lifted me like I weighed nothing, which I probably didn't after 11 days of near starvation, and carried me to their canoe. The ride downstream took maybe 11 hours, though time had become meaningless by that point. The river widened gradually as we traveled, the jungle giving way to occasional clearings with small farms, chickens scratching in the dirt, children waving from the banks. Each sign of civilization felt surreal after so long surrounded by nothing but green. The loggers gave me water from a canteen and some kind of mashed yucca that I could barely swallow, but my stomach accepted. They asked more questions, which I answered in fragments. Yes, Flight 508. Yes, on Christmas Eve. Yes, we crashed. No, I don't know exactly where. The bearded one radioed ahead from a handheld transceiver. His Spanish too fast for me to follow, but I caught the word gringa and milagro, miracle. At some point, I passed out again, waking to the sound of another engine, this one much louder. A helicopter, painted with medical symbols, hovering over a small dock where the canoe had pulled up. Men in clean clothes and medical gloves lifted me onto a stretcher, hooked up an IV, asked questions I couldn't answer anymore, and then we were airborne, the jungle falling away below, and I watched it recede with emotions I couldn't name. Terror, relief, grief, rage. That green hell had tried to kill me for 11 days straight, and I'd beaten it. The hospital in Pucallpa was chaos when we landed. Doctors and nurses rushing to triage my injuries. Reporters already gathered outside wanting the story. Government officials demanding answers about the crash. But I only had eyes for one person. Dad, standing in the corner of the examination room with tears streaming down his face, looking 10 years older than when I'd last seen him 2 weeks earlier. Julie, he whispered, and the sound of his voice broke something inside me that I'd been holding together through sheer will. I sobbed into his chest while doctors worked around us, all the fear and pain and horror finally pouring out because I was safe. I was home. I'd made it. Later, hours or days, the timeline blurs, they told me the full death toll. 91 dead out of 92 passengers and crew. Mom's body recovered and identified. 14 others confirmed to have survived the initial fall based on their injuries and positions, but they'd all died within days, waiting in place for rescue that couldn't find them in time. I was the only one who walked out, the only one who followed the water, and that knowledge that I'd lived when 91 others hadn't became a weight I'd carry for the rest of my life. But that's a story for the final part. The hospital room in Pucallpa smelled like disinfectant and floor wax, sterile and safe in a way that felt alien after 11 days of mud and rot. Doctors stitched up my arm, 37 stitches to close the cavity the larvae had carved out, set my collarbone, drained the fluid from my knee, pumped me full of antibiotics to fight the half-dozen infections raging through my system. IV fluids for the dehydration, pain medication that finally, mercifully dulled the constant ache to something manageable. They kept me sedated for the first 48 hours because my body was in shock, shutting down from the cumulative trauma of the fall, the walk, the starvation, the infections. When I finally woke up properly on January 5th, 1972, Dad was sitting beside my bed holding my hand, and the look on his face told me everything I needed to know before he said a word. "Your mother," he whispered, and his voice broke. "Julie, they found the wreckage. They found bodies. Your mother didn't make it." I'd known, somewhere deep down, from the moment I woke up alone in that clearing on Christmas morning. But hearing it confirmed, hearing it spoken out loud in that quiet hospital room, made it real in a way I wasn't prepared for. The grief hit like a physical blow, doubling me over despite the broken collarbone, and I sobbed until there was nothing left inside me but hollow emptiness. They kept me in that hospital for 2 weeks, monitoring my recovery, making sure the infections cleared, that my wounds healed without complications. Reporters camped outside my room day and night, desperate for interviews, for the story of the miracle girl who survived when 91 others died. The newspapers called me the girl who fell from the sky, ran my graduation photo next to images of the twisted wreckage, published speculation about how I'd lived when physics said I should have died on impact. Government officials came asking questions about the crash. what I remembered, whether the crew made announcements, if I could pinpoint the exact location where we went down. I answered mechanically, my mind still half in the jungle, still hearing Mom's last words over and over. "This is it, Jewel." That phrase became a soundtrack I couldn't turn off. Playing during meals, during physical therapy sessions, during the long sleepless nights when pain medication wasn't enough to stop the nightmares. I'd close my eyes and feel the floor vanishing beneath me, see the wing tearing off in flames, watch Mom's hand slip from mine as we fell into black nothing. Then I'd jolt awake screaming, nurses rushing in to calm me down, Dad holding me while I shook and cried. PTSD, the doctors called it. Post-traumatic stress disorder. A fancy medical term for something much simpler. I was broken inside, and no amount of stitches or medication could fix it. On January 12th, search and rescue teams located Mom's body in the wreckage, guided by the maps I'd drawn from memory of my trek downstream. They brought her back to Lima for burial, and Dad and I flew there for the funeral, my first time on a plane since the crash. I spent the entire flight rigid with terror, every bump of turbulence sending panic shooting through me, convinced we were going down again. But we landed safely, and 3 days later I stood beside Mom's grave in a Lima cemetery, rain falling in sheets, and tried to make sense of a universe that would save me while taking her. She was the ornithologist, the expert on owls and jungle ecosystems. She'd spent 20 years studying the Amazon, knew its dangers and rhythms better than almost anyone alive. If survival was about knowledge and expertise, she should have lived and I should have died. But that's the thing about disasters. They don't follow logic. They don't reward the deserving or punish the unprepared. They're random and brutal and utterly indifferent to human notions of fairness. The only difference between me and those 14 other survivors who died in the jungle was one remembered lesson from my father. Follow the water downstream. That's it. That's the thin line between my name on a gravestone and my name in survival textbooks. And the weight of that knowledge, the survivor's guilt of being the lucky one, became something I'd carry for the rest of my life. We returned to Germany in February, to Kiel, where I'd planned to attend university before the crash derailed everything. The nightmares followed me across the Atlantic. Every night, the same dreams. Falling, the plane breaking apart, Mom's hand slipping away, the jungle closing in, maggots writhing under my skin. I'd wake up screaming at 2 or 3 in the morning, drenched in sweat, unable to go back to sleep. Food tasted like ash. Friends from my old school in Lima wrote letters I couldn't bring myself to answer, because what do you say to people whose biggest problems are exam scores and dating drama when you've literally watched 91 people die? I wandered Kiel streets like a ghost, this 17-year-old girl with visible scars on her arm and invisible ones everywhere else. The physical wounds healed over months. The collarbone knitted back together. The knee regained most of its range of motion. The gash on my arm closed into a thick, ropey scar that itched in cold weather. But the mental wound stayed raw. I'd hear a plane overhead and freeze, heart hammering, transported back to that cabin filling with screams. Thunder would send me diving under tables, certain lightning was about to tear the world apart again. Crowds made me panic because too many bodies pressed too close, reminded me of the cabin in those final seconds. I was functional, but fundamentally changed, living in a world that felt paper thin and ready to collapse at any moment. What saved me, ironically, was the very thing that had nearly killed me: the jungle. I enrolled at the University of Kiel in fall of 1972 to study biology, following in my parents' footsteps because it was the only thing that made sense anymore. If Mom's death had to mean something, then maybe it meant continuing the work she'd started. I threw myself into studying zoology with an intensity that worried my professors, spending 18-hour days in labs and libraries, memorizing taxonomies and ecosystems and behavioral patterns. When I focused on science, on the orderly logic of classification and observation, the chaos in my head quieted down just enough to function. I specialized in mammalogy, particularly bats, Dad's area of expertise, and my thesis research gave me structure and purpose when I had nothing else. The nightmares didn't stop, but they became less frequent. The panic attacks didn't vanish, but I learned to manage them. And slowly, painfully, over years, rather than months, I rebuilt something resembling a normal life, from the wreckage of that Christmas Eve. I met Eric Diller in 1976, another biology student with a passion for tropical entomology. We bonded over shared research interests, and he was patient with my trauma in ways most people couldn't be. He understood when I had to leave movie theaters because the sound was too loud, when I couldn't sleep with windows closed because it felt like being trapped in that cabin again, when certain dates triggered breakdowns I couldn't control. We married in 1980, and he supported my decision to return to Peru despite knowing it meant revisiting the place that had stolen so much from me, because Peru was calling me back, Panguana specifically. Dad had kept the research station running alone after Mom died, cataloging species and maintaining the buildings, but he was getting older and the work was too much for one person. In the mid-'80s, I started making regular trips back to help with field work, and every time I stepped off the plane in Pucallpa, every time I took that boat upriver to the station, I felt the Amazon reaching for me. The place that should have been my grave had instead become my second chance. Dad passed away in 2000, and I inherited Panguana along with the responsibility of continuing his life's work. I became the director of the research station, the same buildings where I'd grown up learning to read the jungle. And here's the strange, beautiful irony of my story. I now spend months every year living in the Amazon rainforest, studying the bats that fly through those same trees I crashed through in 1971, swimming in tributaries of the same river that led me to salvation. The jungle took my mother from me, scarred me physically and mentally, gave me nightmares that lasted decades. But it also taught me something most people never learn, that survival isn't about being the strongest or the smartest or the most prepared. It's about making one good decision in the middle of chaos and following through even when everything hurts and hope seems impossible. Those 14 other survivors who died in the jungle while I walked out, they weren't weaker than me. They weren't less deserving. They just made a different choice. They stayed in place and waited for rescue. I followed my father's advice and moved with purpose, following the water downstream. That's the only difference. One remembered lesson applied at the moment it mattered most. People ask me constantly if I'm afraid of flying now. The honest answer is yes, every single time. My heart rate spikes during takeoffs. Turbulence makes my hands shake and my breath comes short. I'll never board a plane without remembering that moment when the floor vanished and I fell into the sky. But I fly anyway, dozens of times a year, because the alternative is letting that one disaster define and limit the rest of my life. Fear is information. Pain is information. They tell you something's wrong, but they don't get to control your choices unless you let them. I learned that in the jungle, and I've applied it to everything since. In 2011, I finally felt ready to tell the full story, so I wrote my autobiography, When I Fell from the Sky, working with a German journalist to put together all the pieces I'd avoided talking about for 40 years. Publishing that book was like lancing an old wound. Painful but necessary, releasing decades of pressure. It became an international bestseller, translated into 12 languages, and readers from around the world sent letters saying, my story gave them hope or courage or perspective on their own struggles. That feedback meant more than any award or recognition ever could, because it meant Mom's death and my survival added up to something larger than just tragedy. In 2019, the Peruvian government awarded me the Order of Merit for Distinguished Services to Peru, recognizing my decades of conservation work at Panguana. Standing there in Lima accepting that medal, 48 years after the crash that should have killed me, I thought about those 91 people who didn't get second chances, about Mom, who should have been there celebrating with me, about those 14 survivors whose names nobody remembers because they made one different choice. And I understood, finally, what my responsibility was. I survived so I could carry their stories forward. I survived so I could teach others the lesson that saved me. In crisis, don't freeze. Don't wait for rescue that might not come. Assess your situation, remember what you know, and move with purpose toward safety. Follow the water, literal or metaphorical, because staying still is just slower dying. That philosophy applies to jungles and plane crashes, but it also applies to grief, to trauma, to any situation where you're broken and alone and can't see a way forward. You followed the flow. You take one step, then another, even when it hurts. You keep moving until you reach something better. So let me bring this back to where we started, to that open question I promised to answer at the very beginning. What really saved me when 14 others died? It wasn't luck, though luck played a role in surviving the fall itself. It wasn't strength or intelligence or superior survival skills. Some of those other passengers probably had more wilderness experience than my 17-year-old self. What saved me was a single remembered lesson applied at the right moment. Find water and follow it downstream. Dad taught me that on a random afternoon hike years before the crash, just throw away advice he probably forgot giving. But I remembered, and when I woke up alone on Christmas morning surrounded by jungle that wanted me dead, that memory became my roadmap to salvation. The other survivors didn't have that specific knowledge, so they made the logical choice of staying near the wreckage, where rescue teams would eventually search. They conserved energy, treated their injuries as best they could, and waited. It would have worked if rescue had come within 3 or 4 days. But it took 11 days for searchers to locate the crash site, and by then everyone who'd stayed in place was gone. I walked out because one old lesson planted years earlier bloomed exactly when I needed it most. Now here's my question for you, and I genuinely want to know your answer in the comments below. If you found yourself in an impossible situation, jungle, disaster, personal crisis, whatever, would you stay in place and wait for rescue? Or would you start moving towards safety even without guarantees? There's no right answer. And honestly, both strategies can work depending on circumstances, but understanding your instinct tells you something important about who you are and how you approach adversity. Drop your thoughts below. Argue with each other if you want. Survival philosophy gets heated, and I love seeing different perspectives. And if this story moved you, if it gave you something to think about or made you see survival differently, hit that subscribe button because I share these kinds of true stories regularly. Stories about ordinary people facing extraordinary circumstances and discovering they're tougher than they ever knew. Share this video with someone who needs to hear that survival is possible even when the odds are impossible. Because that's the real lesson I learned falling from the sky and walking 11 days through hell. We're all capable of more than we think. We all have knowledge planted years ago that might save us in moments we can't predict. And the difference between tragedy and triumph is sometimes as simple as remembering at the right moment and following through despite the pain. Thank you for walking this journey with me, for listening to my story all the way to the end. It means more than you know. I'll see you in the next one. And remember, follow the water. Always follow the water.